A warm welcome to the Evaluation Conference and EvalFest being organized by APR and Evaluation Community of India. I'm Ritu, the founding member of Evaluation Community of India. Very, very pleased that you're all here. In this panel, towards SDGs, gender and equity focused evaluation, we have a lineup of very seasoned professionals. I hope we will all share and learn together. I hand it over to our esteemed chair, Dr. Janvi Andharia. She is Director and Research Fellow, Institute of Social Studies Trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritu. A very warm welcome to all the panelists and all the participants. It's wonderful to be here. And hopefully we'll have an extremely lively conversation because we have a wonderful set of panelists. Just by way of introducing the topic, we are in many ways like at the midpoint of since the SDGs were announced, and we have the goal 2030. And I think there have been marked shifts from when the MDGs were announced. And since then, also we've had several efforts to achieve greater focus on how do we achieve gender equality. We've had also, several other efforts which were, gender index, gender empowerment index, HDI becoming a little more, gender sensitive. And we've put behind us almost 2 decades of work on that. And I think at the time of formation of the SDGs, all of these experiences have been put to good use. So we not only have a specific goal on gender equality, but there has been a very systematic effort to integrate it into several other goals. And I think at a global level, there's definitely, a huge shift that we see. Whether it is at the sector as a whole, whether it is the philanthropy, or whether it is even the corporate sector, and of course, I think those organizations that are working on the ground. And it is in this kind of a background that we are here today looking at, how have SDGs been able to address equity, and how to what extent have the evaluations been truly gender responsive to give us an indication of how close, how far, what is being achieved, what are the challenges. And so in this panel, what we're going to do is going to conduct it like a talk show. As you can see, we have a wonderful set of panelists. Professor Akiko from Japan, Urvashi Prasad from India, Sabrina Evangelista from, she has several years of work with the UNDP and the UN systems, Yamini Atmavilas from philanthropy, BMGF, and Professor Satish Agnihotri from straddling bureaucracy and now also, with an academic institution. So we look forward to having an extremely vibrant discussion. So I'll just pose the next question, the first question that we have, which is, given that each of the panelists have come from an extremely different set of backgrounds, so you're from your own unique positions, what kind of changes do you see have been incorporated in the designing of the programs and the policies since 2015, and in order to address gender equality? And what kind of tools, methods, and indicators you feel have been developed or designed to measure the progress to build this increasing evidence? And first, I'd like to invite Professor Akiko. She's worked with the, can we have the next slide, which has, yeah. Professor Akiko is a professor, Department of Global Politics, Faculty of Law, Hosei University, Japan. And she's worked with the UN systems in several countries in the region, Bhutan, Indonesia, and Thailand. So she brings with her a rich experience of, seeing how these indicators and what has been done specifically in the context of gender responsive evaluation. So over to you, Professor Akiko. Each of the speakers would have about 3 minutes. I'll just give out a call in case it is overrunning, and then we'll move to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Janvi. Thank you for the nice introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. And also, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this wonderful panel. Thank you so much. So from where I sit, I can see changes happening at the overall macro level, but not so much at the micro level of programs and projects. Jambi already mentioned about a shift at the global level, which I see. So let me talk about the macro level changes that I see. One is that after the SDGs were introduced, increased attention was given to gender equality, and also for the SDG goal 5, and also gender as a cross-cutting issue. So the general awareness and understanding increased, that's one. And secondly, in the SDGs voluntary national reports that each country is supposed to submit to the UN's high-level political forum, some countries reported progress in gender equality, including a legal framework, policies, and action plans. But then here I would say that the reporting was good. You can see it as positive, but I would say that in many of these reports, what has been reported was not as in-depth or substantive as I would like. And thirdly, at the macro level, quite a lot of useful analysis were carried out by different organizations on how gender issues are treated or not treated in the SDGs implementation and in the voluntary national reports. And I know Sabrina is here, and I like to mention the Gender Snapshot report published annually by UN Women, which I think is serving an important role in gender responsive monitoring of SDGs implementation by analyzing the voluntary national reports of different countries. So all these changes are positive. I see positive developments at the macro level, but then having the, and also having the SDGs as a global common agreed framework for all the countries, and the expectation that all countries report on the SDGs, including gender issues in the national voluntary report, is serving as a push factor. And then for countries and organizations to pay more attention, okay? But the question is this one: are these positive changes at the macro level translated into real concrete changes at the micro level of programs and projects? And here I would say that I have not seen a whole lot of evidence whether the intentions and commitments expressed in national reports and statements have actually been translated into real and concrete changes in project design or implementation or monitoring and evaluation with the gender responsive lens. So I'm seeing that from my side, but I'm sure other panelists have seen more evidence at the country level. So my point is, I don't think there has been cascading effects or transformative changes to mainstream gender issues in policies, programs, and projects, or to make gender responsive approach the norm for all evaluations. And such changes must be reflected at all stages of the program, and it should be made a norm, and it should be lasting and sustainable. But we are not there yet. So that's my understanding and observation of the whole picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Akiko. And I think that's, let's see what others have said. I've been listening to other panelists in other events of this conference, and I think there are similar kind of observations coming about. And I think a lot of caution is what you are saying, that let's be more focused, let's be more conscious, and make, in the second half of this period that we have, how can we improve that? I'd now like to invite Ms. Urvashi. She's the director of, can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, we'll have Ms. Urvashi Prasad. She's Director, Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office, Niti Aayog, which is the planning kind of commission at India. And she's had extensive experience in health, nutrition, and sanitation on gender issues and in public policy. And I'd now like to invite her to give her comments as to what she's seeing, maybe more specifically from the India perspective, because she is in a very critical position, and she's able to perhaps get a bird's eye view of what's happening in the country. Over to you, Urvashi.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, as part of this, I think, absolutely critical discussion. And yes, as you said, a lot of what I'll share will be from actually different perspectives that I worked in the Indian development sector and also now the policy space, and how I've seen, this sort of aspect really evolve. So I think first is that definitely there is a strong global influence that we have here, and as was mentioned, the SDGs, the voluntary national reviews that countries have been doing, and also the several indices that are now being developed and also widely disseminated. And we have specifically on gender, we have the Gender Inequality Index and also the Global Gender Gap Index. And in fact, what we're doing in India is we're sort of building out India versions of these with indicators that reflect our context and not just limiting it to the national level. Because obviously in a country like India, complex federal structure, just looking at anything at the national level is really never enough. And we have to go down to the state level and even below that. So that is what we have been trying to do. In fact, even the organization I work with, the Governance Policy Think Tank, to actually take some of this global emphasis, which is now coming about on gender, especially, and how do we really translate that into the Indian context, as well as, not just at the national level, but also the subnational level. So I think that is one piece of it, which definitely sort of indicates to me that there is an increasing focus on looking at these aspects. There is, these are given due importance now in the policy space. Even the policymakers are interested in terms of what is really the differential impact of programs, of policies on women or even other groups. Here, women also is it's not a homogeneous group after all. There's different kinds of caste and religious and other kinds of socioeconomic sort of differences there that come into the mix. So I think there's definitely interest, there's definitely greater focus. But I think in a country like India, what is, obviously the most challenging is to translate that into every level of the system. Like I said, national is not enough. We have to go down to state, district, and even below that, because the country is simply so large. Also, we have to go beyond. This is not something we do just because we want to tick a box, or because it's the right thing to do or the right thing to say, but because it actually makes our policies and programs more effective and their implementation much more effective. And I think this is an appreciation that we need to still ensure is really there amongst all stakeholders. And there is ownership of this agenda, rather than it just being pushed down, or people having to do it because, you have to do it for compliance purposes. So I think we need to go, beyond this. I think we've definitely made a good start, that we've started giving importance to this, but there's a lot more that we need to do to actually translate it into meaningful action at all levels and amongst all stakeholders. So that is I think my biggest sort of point on this. One other quick point though I will make is that even in the programs and policies in India, I've seen that over the last few years there is an increased focus on when we look at women in particular, and I think some of that also has to do with the political arena, that the woman vote has actually become quite important. I think we don't often talk about this, but ultimately policies, programs, somewhere they flow from the politics of it all as well. So whether we talk of India's sanitation program or our clean energy program, there's much more interest and talk about how does it differentially impact women, and therefore what role would the woman voter play when they go to elections. So I think this is a positive, while of course there's a lot more that we need to do, and we do have a lot of those discussions and debates on truly what is autonomy and truly what is agency, and I think those are all very valid. But just seeing it, at this higher level, I feel that this is a good direction. But we need to build on it and really take it, as I said, to all levels and to all stakeholders. So yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Urvashi. I think you made an excellent point in terms of saying that we need to, in large countries, we need to look at going down to the next level, and perhaps in some ways it is a response to also what Professor Akiko said, that not enough is being done, and what you're saying is that you need to take it down, you need to decentralize it to actually be able to see changes at the micro level. And then the other important point, of course, is on the political component, and that women's voices in electoral spaces has increased, at least in terms of how their vote is shaping the outcomes of elections. And those are interesting connections that you're drawing, and perhaps also interesting, hopefully more questions will come from the floor on that. And we'll now move on to the next speaker. So can you also change the slide, please? Going to invite Sabrina now, who is at the Regional Evaluation Office as a specialist of UN Women in the Regional Office of Asia and the Pacific. She has over 15 years of professional experience, including with multiple entities of the UN systems. And her passion for evaluation stems from her own training in public health, where she was inspired to ensure actions which were making a difference. And she is extremely embedded in community-based processes and approaches. So let's see from her own experience of working on the ground and now also working at the regional and policy level, what does she have to say about how do we see this being incorporated in design and outcomes at evaluation from a gender focus. Over to you, Sabrina.
Thank you so much, Janvi, and thanks so much to the APEA organizers for organizing this session, which is so critical, and for inviting me to participate with this esteemed panel. So yeah, I wanted to focus on sort of where I'm at right now in terms of the institutional changes within the UN system since the SDGs came on board. I wanted to highlight three factors that I think can be, replicated elsewhere. And just to simplify it, I think we all know that the twin track approach works. So the SDGs, they established a standalone goal for equality, and they mainstreamed it, as Professor Akiko has mentioned. This is so fundamental because it recognized that gender equality is important in and of itself as a fundamental human right, but also that it's fundamental to achieving the rest of the goals. And so what that means in an institutional perspective is that within the UN system, the agencies have had to really integrate gender equality, human rights perspective in their work. And so what we've seen within the evaluation field is that, for example, after the SDGs were adopted, the norms and standards that were established by the UN system, so the United Nations Evaluation Group established norms and standards, and they highlighted human rights and gender equality as a standalone norm. They also started reporting through the United Nations SWOP. So I'll also speak about that. But I just wanted to highlight that, it's really through having this standalone criterion now on gender equality and also mainstreaming it throughout the evaluation process, the evaluation questions, evaluation methods, that we're really able to build the evidence base. And hopefully over time, this will ensure that we can better measure progress towards inclusive, sustainable development. So the second thing I wanted to highlight was incentives for change. And so this was where UN Women was able to really leverage the momentum from this SDGs, but also its mandate to really influence and hold the UN system accountable for integrating gender equality. So this was through what I mentioned, the UN SWAP. So it's the United Nations System-Wide Action Plan for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. And actually a specific indicator for evaluation was included there. And the UNEG, so United Nations Evaluation Group, has been collecting information from the reporting entities and sharing publicly this annual report on how how the progress against this evaluation indicator is moving. And this has really, it's been interesting because it really incentivized the UN evaluation offices to systematically integrate a gender perspective. Of course, there's varying quality, and as of now, it's all self-reported. So there's, of course, much to be done, but this does build in an institutional mechanism for holding the system accountable. And it also ensures that we have this broader, wider, stronger evidence base on what works to achieve gender equality. And that can be used to inform programming and policy efforts. And thirdly, I wanted to highlight how important it is to recognize and ride momentum when it's here so that we can produce those catalytic effects. So for example, with this UN SWAP for gender equality, there's now within the UN system a similar process for integrating inclusion and disability perspective. So now we have a new indicator for looking at that across evaluations. And then, for example, within UN Women, there's a wealth of capacity building materials. For example, from UN Women's Women Count initiative, there's a enhanced gathering, analysis, use of data and for gender statistics. We also have more guidance, for example, from UN Women on including diverse sexual orientation and gender identity in humanitarian monitoring. So while there is still a lot more work to be done, when we're able to really ride that momentum and use that as an advocacy tool, it does create change. And but more is definitely needed now. I think right now, globally, there's been a spotlight on the intersecting forms of discrimination, as mentioned earlier. Really, we need more information, more data, and to spotlight those that have been invisible in typical data and evaluations. We need to look across race, ethnicity, sexual identity, religious beliefs, etc., to really understand who's being left out and who's being included, and what those differences mean for progress against the SDGs. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks, Sabrina. I think it was very important to hear, what specific efforts have been done and how, the UN system is incentivizing, and that's perhaps a very promising way to get government and get agencies to report on stuff. And but I think the data bit remains a challenge. And as Akiko said, that how do we close that gap? And maybe we'll talk about that in the second round. I'll now move to Yamini Atmavilas. Can we change the slide? Thank you. So Yamini comes with over 2 decades of experience in research, in working on philanthropy and evaluation, capacity building in gender, health, education, and economic development. She's very passionate about women's work, both in the formal and the informal sector. And so she currently is the Senior Program Officer, Gender Norms, Women's Economic Empowerment and Gender Data at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So obviously she also has a kind of both a macro and a micro level view in terms of what's working. So over to you, Yamini.
Thank you, Janvi. And it's hard to sort of add to what others have said before, but I have a bit of a comparative advantage of, having a little more time to think. So I would say, first of all, for us as a philanthropic organization, we've gone through an organizational process and, very recently announced the gender division, which I think has been the culmination of many, many years of internal champions, Melinda's own voice, and thinking around, the need for that, I think Sabrina talked about this horizontal sort of gender integration across all of our work, as well as building out a really dedicated division that is going to be looking at gender equality programming across multiple areas. So organizationally, this has been a huge leap for us, and we're very excited. It comes with a number of partnerships, a lot of work that has already happened prior, and joining hands with several other philanthropists, country policymakers, as well as partnerships across other sectors. So that's sort of our own organizational journey. And what that has sort of brought us to, especially in this moment, are a few things, and I'll lay them out at a very high level. First is, I think, connecting globally with other philanthropic and other financing organizations to really be thinking about SDG financing and where one could add voice as well as resources for gender equality. A second area, as you and others have mentioned, is this whole measurement and tracking progress. And so there again, we've connected with Hewlett Foundation on Data 2X, this very large initiative that's been identifying gender data gaps in measurement, but also what are the new sort of measures that one needs to put in place? And so there's pretty large global agenda around that. A third area, of course, is partnering with the UN organizations. Women Count is a really great example of how that's coming together to both track progress on specific areas to do with gender equality, as well as harmonizing indicators across systems, across countries, to make sure that there's a comparable view of things. At the same time, I think we are also sort of working on a lot of in-country work to make sure, what Urvashi and others have talked about, this need for both harmonization and a big picture view, but then, ensure that there's actual contextual understanding of change, of what those phenomena mean in country and subnationally. So there is a lot of focus we are bringing on doing in-country work on this as well. And finally, I'll just say, a big area of focus for us on, especially given, is working with the ILO and sort of thinking about unpaid care measures and doubling down on how to measure those better. And this has been a long process. It's certainly not something initiated by us, but given the Gates Foundation's focus on, especially in the COVID recovery context, but even more, broadly on unpaid work and addressing the unpaid work burden on women, we are sort of looking at supporting some of these larger initiatives like that. I guess my micro final point is really to say, I think COVID has really shifted a lot of things for us, and that focus, doubling down on that focus on inequality, on reversals and gains that had been made on pulling people out of poverty, out of inequality. I think those are areas that a lot of us are definitely thinking about ways we can integrate in programming, and trying to make them, both track, but actually program to make sure that those are not left behind, are not left out just because we're chasing averages and average increases.
Thank you, Yamini. And I think an interesting point you made is that, we need to start at the organization itself. You can't commit to talk about changes outside if you're not making changes internally. And I think these are critical when we talk about gender outcomes and how do we become more gender responsive. so that does not become a tick box, that it actually is something that is integral and long lasting. Now, the final speaker I'd like to invite is Dr. Satish Agnihotri. He is head of the Center for Technology Alternatives for Rural Areas based at IIT. And he's also associated with the Center for Policy Studies. He's been a career bureaucrat and has served the government of India and the state of government of Odisha, and has worked on issues of severe malnutrition and other issues. But I think that's something that he has been engaged with on a long-term basis. Over to you, Professor Satish.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
My academic trajectory will probably reveal the confusions I have gone through, moving from physics to environmental engineering to rural development, and finally a PhD in gender. But then let me come to this. As Yamini said, my task is relatively easier because the earlier speakers have flagged the need for unpacking the SDGs, particularly SDG 5. We have talked of localization, we have talked of unpacking it by communities, and Akiko shared our common frustration that is it percolating down in terms of data. And I would thank Yamini for bringing that issue of inequalities, which need to be both studied and addressed. Now, so it's easier for me to move from problem identification more towards the calibrated solution. And I have shared one PPT, which probably you could share it among the participants, because it is a fairly exhaustive list of indicators that we need to look at if we are serious about gender inequalities. And this is something which I had presented to Committee of Secretaries way back in 2014, but more things change, the more they seem to remain the same. Yes, there is seriousness. Yes, there is seriousness at the level of NITI also, but then the score of SDG 5 tells you all. And we also need to look at what does the voluntary reporting hide rather than what it reveals. Because when it comes to gender inequalities, my own feeling is that you should measure the glass from bottom upwards. You need to measure it from the brim downwards. And I'll give a quick example. If you say our immunization coverage is 87% among children and only 17% are left, then chances are that 17% left out will have preponderance of the child. So I think we need to take a look at that. Two recent trends that we need to look at, and when Niti talks about the difficulties in localization, I was slightly surprised why are we not looking at either the convergence or divergence between the SDG 5 score and the GDI, the Gender Development Index. And Gender Development Index has a head start, so you can look at localization even right down to the district level. And now SDG localization to district level has started at the northeastern states, but I think we should do it for the rest of the country. The two trends which I will quickly flag. One is this debate which you have seen about SDG rebooting versus using this pandemic opportunity to achieve the SDGs. And I kind of stereotype them in terms of a Lancet editorial versus a Nature editorial. We need to look at that. And there are two questions become important, that during COVID, have the inequalities been exacerbated? And more or less the anecdotal evidence seems to say yes. And then a more important question is, are we building back better through the gender lens? Or are we just saying build back better, but be gender blind? And if we want to do that, you need to check every indicator and for different denominations. So whether it is a tribal women or whether it is the urban women, it will make a difference. And we need to look at not leaving out a particular denomination. So there, that list which I have given will come in fairly handy. One frustration comes about the data sources. You suddenly say, okay, this score is so much, this is the parameter. I'm just quickly putting on the chat box a URL, sdg.indiagis.org, which actually source authenticates each piece of information. And I would request the community here to kind of enrich that particular website and the discussion. I mean, frankly speaking, if ISST is willing, we could kind of expand on that particular site, at least for SDG 5. And the last point which I had was that we need to seriously look at what is happening to the digital divide in gender terms, and more importantly, the digital violence. The kind of digital violence one seems to be getting away with is worrying, and that's something which between now and 2030 needs to be brought down to near zero. I'll stop at that, and I'll come to the more practical aspects in the second round. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Satish. I think you've raised many interesting points, and I think together the speakers have raised, technical issues as well as grounded issues, and locating it in the COVID context, because that's a very real one. Just move on to the next question now, the second prompt, and we do a second round of conversations. So given that, okay, there is a commitment and we have recognized that, okay, there are some gaps. We just wanted to use, this round of conversation to talk about what really are the kind of capabilities, whether they are technical capabilities, their financial capabilities, human capabilities, and even the political commitments, that are required to truly integrate gender responsive and gender transformative lens while you're looking at evaluation programs. And this is more a little bit more technical and getting into the more nitty-gritties of the question. So moving from the first round, going down to, looking at what is actually working. And I can see some of the chat questions and remarks that are, also pointing to these kind of questions, that how do you really integrate that? And do we have the capacities to do that? And secondly, if you can also comment, if you have time within the 3 minutes that each of you have, is to how adequate are they? I mean, we've said globally that they are not adequate, but these capabilities, what will they do to incrementally increase that? And I think that recognition, or to making it a little more pointed in terms of how it will fill in the gaps that we already know exist. And for this round, I am going to invite first. I'm going to change the order of the speakers this time, so that we have a little more. Not everybody feels that we are. Our number is coming later on. So for the second round, I'm going to first ask Yamini to give her thoughts, please. And we can spotlight Yamini this time now.
Thanks, Janvi. I think the building on all the comments, and especially Dr. Satish's points at the end, I'll just I'll try to limit to 2 or 3 key points. Right? I think the first one is just what we've talked about for a very long time, but I think, measuring equity, measuring intersectionality. So I think both, there've been some methodological experiments, but we have to get really good about it. And we have to be, the evaluation field has to really rise to this challenge and be able to put together the right kinds of measures, the right kind of narrative, and the right kind of, voices into that mix. And all of those are credible. So I think one is that we have to, in some ways, ensure that we are bringing both. I mean, if somebody wants to look at quantitative data, you have an audience that is only focused on that, let's rise to that challenge and do it. To the extent that we want to be able to be authentic and really bring together participatory approaches, quantitative information, bundle that together, gives really solid qualitative depth, deep understanding. Let's do that. But let's do it. I think the time to act on some of this is now, and there's a lot of capability, a lot of experts have worked on this. Let's really pull that together as a field and really come together to set some some sort of a collaborative or an agreement around this. The second is, I think, this whole question of decolonizing evaluation. There's lots of conversations happening around decolonizing public health, decolonizing other fields. I think evaluation has to become a lot more of a tool that is off, for, and to the bank, and usable by communities, by women, by the marginalized, in a way that doesn't feel like it's this abstract science that is somehow extracting data and extracting information and is going to sort of, get somebody, a great article, but at the end of the day, we don't really necessarily close that loop on the ability of communities and of women to use that information, that data. So to both inform it as well as to use it. And South Asia has been a hub of participatory evaluations. I mean, so it's not new to us, but let's bring that forward and let's make it real, and let's make it a core part of how we do evaluation. On the last I would say is just, I think, this question of capacity as well as, the demand for evaluations. I think you have, in India, at least, policymakers are always interested in data, in evaluation, in understanding what's happening with programs. And I think, so we have the advantage of that. And I think what, the foundation has been investing in is creating lots of different hubs. So what we call our What Works hubs, but really being methodologically diverse, but focused sort of attention on a few key areas around gender equality. So really getting financing to organizations that are able to do this, that are interested in building capacity, as well as delivering on the kinds of results that we think can inform the field, can really push the agendas on gender equality programming. So I think that vibrancy is where resources should flow, and there is a huge demand, and it's for us to sort of ensure that we're able to meet that demand. And I would say that, as a philanthropic foundation, this is an area that's very, very important to us, and we are sort of doubling down on creating these hubs of excellence that are diverse. So they're not meant to be elite institutions alone, but really sort of take a very network, collaborative approach so that the entire field is able to progress and respond and bring together multiple voices. Thank you.
Thanks, Yamini. I'll now invite Professor Akiko.
Yes, thank you very much. Right. In response to the question posed in this round 2, I would say that efforts have not been adequate or effective. So there are several points in that answer. The first thing that's important but is lacking is the political commitment and strong leadership, because this is really paramount in terms of integrating gender responsive lens in evaluations, but also promoting gender equality. So firm commitment by national leaders must be there, and that must translate and result in concrete changes to make national laws, policies, action plans, regulations, and also budget allocation and monitoring and evaluation to be truly responsive. And I found Professor Satish's comment very interesting and relevant when he said that posed the question, what does voluntary national reports hide? Yes, very much so, because this commitment at the political level has to be reflected in SDG reviews, implementation, including the preparation of the national voluntary national reports. And all of that should adopt a gender responsive approach. That's the first point. The second point is also what Yamini talked about. It's about capacity building in equity-focused gender responsive evaluation. And this is very critical. A sufficient number of capable evaluators has to be there. So there has to be adequate training, and they have to be equipped with knowledge and capabilities that are needed. And this requires technical support, financial support, as well as adequate human resources, because they have to not only do their job, but also serve as trainers. The third point is collection and analysis of gender segregated data and production of timely reports. And this is a weakness, a major weakness in many countries. For this, technical support is needed, technical capabilities, human capabilities, and national statistical offices must be enhanced and strengthened, because otherwise we can't get this. And political commitment is needed to make this a national priority. So again, we go back to the political commitment from the top. And that also requires financial resources to be allocated so that the national statistical offices can be strengthened and build, and for their capacity to be built. The fourth point is the need to recognize and address the intersection between gender inequality and other forms of inequality, such as discrimination based on race, religion, ethnicity, and any other identity. And as we know, many women and girls face multiple forms of discrimination that intersect with each other. Equity-focused gender-responsive evaluation must examine such intersection of inequalities. And to do this systematically and thoroughly, technical support capabilities are necessary, human capabilities, financial support is needed. And in addition, the political support is needed so that different ministries of the government that work on one part of the discrimination can work together on this multi-sectoral issue. The fifth and final point is that in order to address gender issues more effectively, we have to go into some of the very difficult areas, which is structural and underlying causes and social norms that influence and perpetuate gender inequality and discrimination. And this is certainly a challenging issue, but then we need to tackle that, and then it requires all capabilities: financial, human resources, technical, and political. So those are my 5 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Akiko. We'll move to Professor Satish now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jannavi. As I said in the second round, I will come to very practical points. First is you need a data spine with what I call analysis-ready data, because researchers find this extremely frustrating to download all the information from government sites in PDF and then again converting it into Excel sheets, even if it is not a classified information. What you actually need is a data spine which has analysis-ready data. You also need, very importantly, a geospatial mapping. The GIS maps are important because data tells you whether the shoe pinches. Maps tell you where does the shoe pinch. And it is in this context that IIT Bombay has a GISE hub. And it is, let me assure Yamini that it is non-elitist by design, because we actually interact and train some of the NGOs and field officers in government, so that it doesn't remain an exercise at national or state level secretariats. The third reason why I'm talking in terms of geospatial analysis is that this is very important in finding out where inequalities are there, both in terms of communities. So whether you take the tribals, the nomadic tribes, the scheduled castes, or even urban rural. If you also look at HDI and SDG 5 score and do a regional analysis, it reveals a lot. And this is something which I think NITI should very strongly look at. And this frustration of district level localization is something which we need to add with the help of this data. And which is where I'm again coming back to that site which I mentioned. So sorry, I gave a wrong URL first, but I have given the correct URL. It actually gives you source authenticated data location. So please use it, and please also enrich it so that we can expand it. It's a very practical way. One important point which I would emphasize is that which institution sets it up, it doesn't matter. There needs to be a help desk for customized training and capacity building. Because whether it is budget analysis, where you learn to look at the BE versus the RE and find out why budgets are surrendered only for women's related program, or whether you look at, we keep shouting about helminth problem and women don't get albendazole. We look at spacing being less or more, but we don't look at the tetanus toxoid booster as an indicator, relevant indicator. So I think there's a help desk which should help NGOs and civil society. Who does it is unimportant. We can help anyone who comes forward. Yeah, I think so. Right now, I will say that if you want the gender concerns in SDG to percolate down below, then SDG mechanism has to percolate down below. The help desk has to be available for capacity building, and data and maps should be available in a user-friendly format. This is something which IIT Bombay can help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Satish. I think that's very useful information for all our participants here to know about this, and I'm sure that everybody's already logging in to find out more on it. Sabrina, would you please go next?
Thank you so much, Janvi. And yeah, just listening to all the feedback, something that I often reflect on is how we're often preaching to the choir, is what we often say, because we're always speaking to other gender experts, other people that want the same things, right? But I think what we need to do is some sort of introspective looking at actually how can we incentivize those non-gender experts into understanding why this is so critical. And I think that's kind of the hook that maybe is missing, is that, we have to kind of shift the narrative, and perhaps not just always saying it needs to be, gender responsive, but like, how can we really see what are the needs from particular sectors in agriculture and climate change, and really shifting the narrative to seeing how this gender perspective can really influence and help them sort of sector experts achieve the goals they want to achieve. And so just with reflection on what the UN system has done, again, institutionally, I think these kind of incentive mechanisms do work, and they can be a way of just, ticking the box, as some were saying, but I think they establish approaches and systems that can also move things forward. So, for example, UNEG has established competencies for evaluators, and that includes integrating gender and human rights in evaluation. And I've had the great opportunity of working with young professionals, both interns and evaluation analysts. And I wanted to thus invite my colleague, Arushi, to provide her perspective on what we can do to really, from a young and emerging evaluator's perspective, what we can do to enhance capacities. So over to you, Arushi.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to APEA for providing a space to young evaluators such as me to put forth my opinions on this crucial theme along with such seasoned experts in the field. Just a quick introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Arushi, based out of New Delhi, and working with Sabrina and UN Women as the evaluation analyst for the Asia Pacific Regional Office since the past 1 year. Professor Akiko and Yamini, Sabrina, Dr. Satish have spoken so well and practically on the need for capacities at different levels for gender responsive evaluations. So to this, hopefully I can add some perspective as a youngish professional in this field, and I'll try to be quick. From my short experience as a young evaluator in the field of gender responsive evaluations, I've noticed that we have been largely absent from this process, but there is something that young evaluators do bring to this table. This is often in the form of new ideas or new digital tools or even a fresh perspective on gender issues, but almost always we bring this great gusto to take forward feminist principles and confront barriers to gender equality. In my time with UN Women, there has never been a time in my experience that my ideas, views, or feedback have been discounted on the basis of my age or my experience. Young evaluators need to be involved in these processes and dialogues with program partners or with senior management that promotes institutional learning and accountability. Of course, it's also these professionals' responsibilities to enthusiastically engage and participate in the systems that are reinventing their processes, keeping gender at the center stage. Understanding gender and intersectionality can be confusing and requires decrypting theories of change and logic models and then applying a gender lens to them. At UN Women, and I'm so grateful that my supervisor and mentor has shared with me various training courses and webinars and of course, opportunities such as these to engage with you all. The onus then lies on us to constantly seek out such opportunities and engage with the community of practice, such as Eval Gender or Eval Youth and APIA itself, to build on their knowledge and hone their technical skills in this dynamic field. This must be supplemented by an enabling environment in the organization that provides the impetus to build on our capacities. Finally, I would like to add that understanding complex interactions of the SDGs and its consequences for gender requires this use of sophisticated evaluation methodologies and application of an intersectional lens. I feel that it's necessary to introduce these concepts in undergraduate studies for social sciences so that these principles are integrated in our thinking at a young age, and we have these ready pointers at hand, irrespective of the field that we step into. If the SDGs are to be realized, young evaluators must take the initiative to be at the center of this process. I'll stop here. Over to you, Dr. Janvi.
Thank you, Arushi. I think it's important to hear young voices, not just as a tick box, but to actually make it happen. And thank you for those pointers and reminders as to what both parties need to do to make it more inclusive. I'd now invite Ms. Urvashi to give her comments on the round 2.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think I'll just make 2-3 points to summarize in a way some of my key thoughts on this. So I think I started off therefore with the political part, and I think I would reiterate that, and I think some of the other panelists have done that too. That the politics of it is actually very important, and again, in a country like ours, it's not just politics at the national level, but state level, and indeed at the local level, and of course at the local levels, we have over the years seen a heightened participation of women, although there's always analysis we do that to what extent do they are they really able to sort of exercise their agency and autonomy in those positions. But nevertheless, we've seen at least more women coming in at those levels. We need the same to happen at the state levels and also at the national level. So I think that is something that I would reiterate. In terms of the actual data, and I think there's some interesting questions on this as well, and thank you for those, because I wanted to bring that up initially as well. I think we've been placing a lot of emphasis on disaggregated data, not just gender, but also, looking at the other divisions within that, whether it's women with disabilities or women from a particular caste or a particular religion. So I think this is something we've been pushing, from Niti Aayog, and in fact, we've been having a lot of discussions on this with the Women and Child Development Ministry as well. And we had actually got some traction on this just before the pandemic hit, which is to say that we need actually a dedicated unit almost within the ministry or within, the WCD departments, which can look at collecting this kind of data on a regular basis, on analyzing it and actually feeding it back into policy, because data is only as good as, the extent to which it is used. And I think that is a very, very crucial, part of it. So I think that is something we will continue to push for. But also we are actually taking, whether it's our SDG index, the SDG index that Niti Aayog has worked on, or other, as I said, India indices of the global, the India versions of the global indices, which are now being released. We are taking them already to the state level, and then hopefully we will also move on to the sub-state levels. In fact, the SDG India Index, we're actually having discussions, workshops in each of the states across the country. So that is already happening, but it is obviously, given the scale of the country, that is obviously a challenge, and that is something that we will have to continue to focus on. So I think, in fact, what we're trying to do is to see how we can get the state level planning departments, because once we've had a reorientation at the national level and a transition from the planning commission to the Niti Aayog, there are state level planning departments which also are in sort of need in a way to reorient their role. And actually, this is one of the roles we think that they can take up, is to look at some of these elements and look at this kind of data collection, and see how it can be fed back into policy making. So I think those are some of the areas that we are focusing on and need to do a lot more in those directions. But yes, I think, I think a point that was made by Sabrina, that, it's not always about, preaching to the converted. So I think this needs to be a much broader sort of discourse. And I think, government obviously has a very big role to play, but we can't do it without the partners, without civil society, without citizens themselves. So I think, while the overall, SDG umbrella talks about integrating all these stakeholders, I think we need to do a lot more in this direction to make sure that all the kinds of voices out there, including people who feel that, why is this critical, or why should I be looking at gender? Why is it important? Do I just have to tick a box, or does it actually make my work better, or does it actually help in other ways? So I think we need to talk with all kinds of people, and have this conversation with all kinds of stakeholders and truly, involve them in the discourse. So I think that is sort of the final point I would make here. Thank you.
Thank you, Urvashi. And I think we've had a really rich conversations coming from the panelists, and a fairly rich discussion on the chat, which is going on. I've been looking at it. I'm going to, a couple of questions which need to be asked directly, and there are a couple which I'm going to kind of synthesize and pose. And so one of the questions that has come up in the chat is a conversation about how is qualitative data, how are evidences that are raised and, got from qualitative experiences? Because when we say that experiences of women are diverse, it needs to take into account the context. A lot of studies are done with a very qualitative methodology in place. So the question kind of is that, how are these qualitative methods finding a place when we are talking about, formalizing, standardizing, or using these qualitative inputs into policy making? And this, if there are actual examples that any of the panelists have, I think it will be very useful to hear how this has been done. That's the first question. The other question is also about if there are actual examples of how political buy-in was got using evaluations to actually bring about shift in policies. If these two examples can be spoken about, I think it will add to the conversation. And I leave the floor kind of open. Any of the panelists could pick up these two questions. So maybe first on the use of qualitative data for policy as part of evaluations, and therefore then leading to policy. And the second is about the political, influence, the ability of these to influence policies from a political will point of view. Anybody?
Should I attempt?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Well, and this brings me back to my bureaucracy days. Data, as I said, that data tells you where the shoe pinches, maps tell you where do they pinch, but actual case studies tell you how do they pinch. And therefore, what happens is that kind of a qualitative data becomes important when you are convincing the polity, or particularly the political executive. I have a very old example where we are looking at the microfinance self-help group performances. And we actually had done a rating of the self-help groups in terms of their repayment schedule. And that repayment schedule in the bankers meeting actually convinced banks to increase the next tranche of funding to the women. Or for example, you can show a mismatch that the districts where dowry incidents, dowry related murders are more, You don't have a dowry prohibition officer, and the districts where these incidents are much less, you have a dowry prohibition officer, not because you needed it, but because her uncle was probably connected to the minister. So, I mean, so much for the, political executive can be eventually influenced more through the corroboration with the qualitative data of a good quantitative analysis. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to this from your experiences as to what worked? Any other panelist? Okay. Maybe we go to the next question about how do we influence the politics and what are the challenges there. Maybe it's a question of one step forward, two step backward, but what has been, for instance, in India, do we have formal mechanisms to inform parliamentarians about gender responsive evaluations, or in any other country? I mean, from the panelists who have had a wide experience from Thailand, Indonesia, other countries of Asia Pacific, do we have experiences of how formal mechanisms have been in place to bring this to the notice of policymakers, elected policymakers? Professor Akiko, Sabrina,
Yes.
Urvashi.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. Right. In terms of the political dialogue, and in a way to increase understanding, this is one of the very difficult things. In Japan, there have been several ways to interact with the parliamentarians, and one was the committee of UN Women in Japan, as well as when UN Women, of course, Sabrina is here, but here in Japan, when UN Women executive director visited, there was always a meeting with a group of parliamentarians, of course, for her to convey and then have a discussion. But at the same time, because I was heading the UNDP office, so often the UN agency heads always got together, and then when we have a dialogue with the parliamentarians, this was one of the issues that was raised. And so we used as much opportunities. For instance, when the administrator of UNDP visited Japan, we always had a meeting with parliamentarians. Actually, the name of the meeting was a Parliamentarian League to Promote Human Security. But of course, as part of human security, gender was included. So we used every opportunity to have a dialogue with parliamentarians, and each time we try to bring in important issues, including gender, and sometimes specifically on gender, to have a dialogue. And each time I feel that there was a little bit more understanding on the part of parliamentarians, and many of them were actually convinced. But then in terms of doing something about it, then I think we still have a long way to go. But I think this is how it works. It's just inch by inch, step by step. So in terms of advocacy, this is something that all UN agencies, all the gender advocates, NGOs, and everybody, we all have to do with the parliamentarians. And in cases where the government is not so positive, we all need to do this advocacy work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, it is step by step, and the more formal steps we have, I think the pressure will keep building. Yes, Professor Satish, would you like to respond?
Yeah, my experience with the political executive, and not just political executive, even at the level of someone like the Chief Secretary or the Development Commissioner, is that you have to clearly differentiate between the doable and the desirable. So when you talk to a politician or political representative about the desirable, you see acceptance, but some kind of a boredom or even a uncertain thing. But if you tell the doable, so for example, if you are talking to a chief minister and you are saying that this is, girls should be empowered and all that, but then when you give a very practical tip, saying that giving bicycles to the girls is something which will improve the thing very much. And it's a very, very opportunistic exercise. I mean, you just have to be at the right moment. And as they say, you have to strike when the iron is hot. And it suddenly appeals. So I think whenever we talk to parliamentarians, it's always good to be very clear in your mind about the doable and the desirable. Advocate the desirable, but as Akiko said, that inch by inch pushing comes to the doables. So you just say that, enhance this scholarship, increase the year of entry into government service just by 2 years, So they realize that, yes, here is a desirable goal, but I shouldn't overdo it. But this doable part, okay, let's let it pass. Sorry, Vamin, please don't
Thank
quote me
you.
outside.
No, I think these are very practical and very doable ones. Thank you, Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I think, there are many efforts throughout the region to build national evaluation systems. And so this is one way of sort of building that enabling environment. And I think, as Akiko has mentioned, the parliamentarians have played a critical role in that and in advocating for national evaluation systems. So I think at least within the UN system, the General Assembly actually established, that national evaluation capacity development is a critical task of all UN evaluations. So we do have this commitment, and what has been going on is really a focus on, this enabling environment, the institutional capacity, and then the individual capacity. So I think particularly through the parliamentarians and establishing these evaluation policies has been a way to sort of move this forward. So I think in Sri Lanka, we've seen evaluation policy. There's moves in Indonesia, other countries in the region. And I think we do need to understand more about, what has worked to really move those processes forward. I know within our sort of network of the UN agencies, there was a study a couple of years ago that was trying to map these efforts and really learn from them. There's a lot of efforts going on in India, as already mentioned. So I think it's just important to now sort of keep the momentum up, learn from what's working there and what are sort of, barriers to that progress. And really, as already mentioned by Dr. Satish, that to get those incentives for establishing these processes and linking it, now we have it all linked with the VNR system as well.
Thank you. True. I'm going to now ask one of the questions posed by Vijita. She's mentioned that a key takeaway for the discussion has been the need for institutionalizing systems whereby disaggregated data is collected at all levels for women and children across age, sex, gender, location, disabilities, and other intersectionalities. As such, data becomes especially critical for tracking and monitoring during emergencies, such as what we faced during the pandemic. And so her question is, what are your thoughts on this and how can this be done? Are there any efforts being done at the DMEO Niti Aayog level or any other level to establish such systems? I think this is an India specific question. So Urvashi, would you like to take that?
Yeah, sure. So, I think, partly as I mentioned, I'd actually seen this question while I was speaking. So partly I sort of addressed it that we are, one route is that we're working through these indices that we have. And we're trying to institutionalize that, as I said, not just at the central level, but also at the state and eventually the sub-state levels. But there's also a lot of work which is happening on looking at the entire evaluation system, trying to put in place a framework really for evaluation. And that is something that we've been working on, and DMEO has been working on, which will obviously, there'll be very important elements of that which will address some of these issues as well. So that is something that we're still working on, because obviously, again, there's complexities of doing that in a federal system. A lot of states, however, have already made progress on this at different levels. And what we're also trying to do is to try and share some of those good examples, because I mean, we talk a lot about the challenges, and undoubtedly there's a lot of challenges, but there's also some good examples from various states in India. So we're also trying to really promote that sort of cross sharing and learning across states, even as we work on this broader sort of national framework for how we should look at evaluations, how should we think about them, data use, and really feeding that into policy making. And I think that is something I sort of come back to again and again, because, while we can put in place systems for collecting data, and that is obviously very important, and that is something we have to do. There's also a lot of fragmentation in our existing data systems that we need to address, because a lot of indicators are actually, data is being collected, but it is not necessarily being pulled together to build a coherent story or a coherent picture. So there might be data currently lying in different programs or different databases, and we actually need to pull all that together. So part of that is, part of it is that effort as well. But I do keep coming back to the use of that data, because I think, again, I saw a comment in the chat box that there's a lot of data that, a frontline health worker or, an Anganwadi worker, for instance, collects. But does she really know what happens to that data? How is it used? What decisions are taken based on that? Because that is very important, so that it's not just a mechanical exercise, for the people who are collecting the data. They don't know what happens after that. So that's where I think the point of, data use and really bringing that ownership into the system, that, this is data that is useful for us and helps us to make better decisions. I think that is something that we're also trying to, bring about a sort of, I would say, a cultural shift there, or a change in the mindset that, data is not just to point out your flaws, but data can actually help you, implement your programs and policies much better. So I think a lot of those efforts are underway at DMEO, at Niti Aayog, and of course we're working with various line ministries at the central level, but then also, as I said, actually with the states, to make sure that they have a platform for sharing some of the good work that they're doing in office. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's really needed, that we kind of close the loop, and I think that's a very rich conversation that has been going on. I think there are, somebody has asked about, as a young professional, what is gender responsive evaluation? I think that's a very straightforward question, and there are some resources that have been shared. But if somebody would like to give a short answer to that, just to kind of spell it out, anybody can take a go at that. How would you define gender responsive evaluation? Yamini, would you like to take that one?
Sorry, sure. I'll just say maybe a couple of things. I mean, you'll find lots of standard textbook definitions if you just look online. But I think one of the main things to focus on is that any gender and equity focused evaluation is about unpacking power, right? So it's not just about creating data. It's not just about, you can do really great designs to sort of understand what's happening, what are the kind of equity and gender gaps that you see. But I think a really good gender focused and gender responsive evaluation for me is going to try to answer the how and the why pieces of it. So the lens has to really be to understand that these inequalities are not just mathematical, and that those inequalities come underpinned with a lot of power differentials. A lot of, somebody else talked earlier about structural sort of factors that keep those inequalities in play. And so really, truly, your toolkit then has to have enough of these different elements that can help you analyze power, analyze inequality in new and interesting ways. And there are lots of frameworks out there, lots of things that one could look at. You could look at adequacy, you could look at affordability, cost and affordability, you could look at access. So many dimensions can be looked at, but I think fundamentally we want to actually see this. And a core element of this, just two things I'll add, is paying attention to time, unpaid work. Those are sort of things that we've become better at. And so paying attention to some of these intended or unintended consequences of gender inequality become very important. So having that theoretical framing, so unpaid work and time and unburdening of women is one. The other is, of course, gender-based violence. So these may not necessarily be core to your question of whatever you're evaluating, but making sure that you build in understandings that these are already established as key parts of social change or closing gender gaps. And so being mindful of those things would be really important. So that wasn't too short, but thank you.
Yeah, no, and there's a ton of resources that people have put on the chat, so I think they can pick it up from there. But I think it's always good to respond. Yeah, Sabrina, please add.
Yeah, I just add, I think, what we kind of boil it down to is the what and the how. So I think the how is just as important as the what we're analyzing, and the process itself has to also be, applying those feminist principles of inclusion, being participatory, transparent. And I think it's, COVID-19 has really put us in a very difficult place because we haven't been able to really, truly do justice to that. But I think it's, also thinking about that process. So of course, use analytical frameworks and sure, we're analyzing from different perspectives. The process of including people that may not typically, or maybe weren't included in the program itself, and ensuring that people have a voice in the evaluation and can inform both the approach and the results of that evaluation. I'll just
Thank you. Thank you. I think these are very critical. We're moving towards the end of the session. I'd like to, pick on one of the threads that has been coming around the chat and use that as the peg to, ask each of the panelists to give their last, say 30, 40 seconds on this question of, if you have any examples or if you want to talk about challenges of using qualitative data effectively in evaluation reports, because a lot of discussion has happened that often this is collected, but they just remain as anecdotes. So what is really the power or the leverage that qualitative experiences, how are they used in evaluations, and also when we talk about significant data being collected? So if you all can just, spend a few moments as your closing remarks and anything else that you would like to talk about as we close this round. I'd invite Sabrina to begin.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jamvi. And this was a great session. And thanks to everyone for the questions. So I think, one of our main challenges is kind of on the communicating data. So communicating evaluation results. So often our evaluations are highly reliant on qualitative data. So we basically rely only on qualitative data. We have also some quantitative data, but it's more reliant on that qualitative data. But I think what it comes down to and what we're trying to improve is really how we're communicating those findings. They are speaking more to the needs of the organization, so they're user-friendly. They're not, there's not too much technical jargon and acronyms, et cetera, used. So that's definitely one sort of task that we're trying to really improve upon, using videos to, I think I remember somebody else saying, what they had done is like a community theater. So when you're talking down at the local level, really thinking of creative ways to communicate those findings. I think also, we've traditionally been stuck on this idea of having to have a report And while of course we have to have that for accountability purposes, I think we really have to see that as not as the primary product, but really as the, maybe for accountability, but like we have to focus our efforts and invest more on those more innovative ways of communicating. And I guess I just wanted to end by saying, I think, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen that we really need to sort of invest, I would say, in the digital gender divide, particularly now that we're doing all this remote data collection. I think this is something really important. And also, secondly, is just working closely with women-led civil society organizations. So we know how important it is, but this is where the voices, based in the community, and they're speaking and they know what's going on. And so more just needs to be done to engage them in our evaluations as a real source of evidence. Even if they're not, one of the specific partners, we can always engage them for to provide context and understanding. So over from me, thanks.
Thank you. I'd invite Yamini to give her concluding remarks.
Sure, thank you. Again, thank you for inviting me. And I think on the specific qualitative question, it's so important, right? I feel like we've championed it for so many years, and that when it comes to doing, we don't actually do it. So I'm glad that you're sort of bringing that back up. And I'm encouraged by the current context on two grounds. One, a lot of our work is in partnership with policymakers, and what we find is they want quick, actionable sort of results. They want quick, actionable insights into programs. They're great. They love also seeing like your RCT results and large quantitative survey data. But actually what they want is how are people experiencing programs and what kinds of course corrections are needed. And I think there is where, we do see a lot of interesting evaluators coming in, being able to actually generate that, being smart about combining, existing data, government data, small surveys, but really bringing those voices out. And this is not a huge movement, but it's definitely beginning to happen. And I think this shift in the evaluation field also on influential evaluations, right? I think that we've been talking about that for several months now. And I think that is really the space that is opening up for methodological diversity and bringing in qualitative voices. Now, the participatory and the community voices, yes, we have to be very creative and make sure we bring that in. But I'm very encouraged by the fact that this is happening. The second I'll just say is we need to go beyond focus group discussions. I think we all say, we triangulate our quantitative with a few focus group discussions. I think we have to invest in deep ethnographic work, deep understandings. And I think I agree with everyone on the chat who said, voices are experience and voice is also data. Like, how do we really shift and explore those definitions? So I think this is a good moment to sort of re-galvanize our thinking and make sure that, there is a call to action around this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yamini. Urvashi? Your concluding remarks, please. You need to unmute yourself if you're speaking.
Hi, you're asking me, right?
Yes. Yeah. Any concluding remarks on,
Yeah. So I'll actually also just maybe touch upon this, the question on qualitative research and evaluation. I think it's true that, in the policy space, at least in the last few years, I've seen that there is definitely greater interest in sort of getting these quicker insights. Actually, a lot of the data that comes in through our surveys, etc., it comes in after considerable lag, and of course a lot of this is quantitative, sort of hard numbers, and of course I think that's also very straightforward to sort of communicate. So I think that's partly why we see that it's kind of taken off a lot more. But now I also concur that there has been this shift in getting findings which are, much more current, so that, course modifications can be made, whether it's for the Clean India, the Swachh Bharat program, or now the tap water program that we have, the Jal Jeevan Mission. We're actually doing all of that. We have people going in to districts, going into states, just doing a quick, assessment of what is the user feedback, how are people feeling about these programs. So I think there is definitely more appetite. It's on us to sort of now do it in a much more regular, systematic manner. Also use the whole diversity of options that we have available. So like we said, focus group discussions is not the only thing. There are other ways in which we can also, obviously get that feedback. So I think we need to use that diversity, make it very relevant to the local context, and then communicate those findings in a way which is, very effective and very actionable. So I think that's what we need to do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're almost run out of time, but we'll take quickly from Professor Satish and then Professor Akiko, concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be quite brief. My one message is that end of the day, we are looking at inequalities, and inequalities actually tend to multiply and not just add. So so graphically putting it, if you happen to be a rural, tribal, disabled girl and mentally disabled at that, then your disadvantages are not like 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. They are 2 to the power 2 to the power 2 to the power 2. They go non-linearly. The practical advantage is that therefore any reduction that you bring on these inequalities non-linearly benefits the person. That's one point. Therefore, this data becomes important. My second point is the data communication. The data visualization and communication does actually matter. You can do problem identification through quantitative methods, but when it comes to finally policy intervention, that one Usaramma who is 73-year-old and she tells you that I don't want dole, but I want Narega wages because I take them home with head high. Or if you take a disabled girl who is moving around as the bank's, local microfinance representative, then suddenly people realize, oh my God, she can. So those qualitative insights, I think they make a lot of difference, but they can't go only on emotive basis, especially when you are dealing with the establishment. To establishment, you go with good quantitative homework, and then tadka is what the qualitative thing comes where you just clinch it. That's my mantra. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely imagery. Professor Akiko?
Yes, thank you. Right. In terms of the qualitative data, some information cannot really be collected in a quantitative way. So we really have to make use of qualitative data, of course, if it can, in combination with quantitative data. For instance, things like power relations, structural problems, and also the intersection of inequalities. The more challenging issues of gender equality are the ones that it's not possible to have quantitative data. So there has to be a higher understanding and higher appreciation of the use of qualitative data and how to use it. So that's my first point. Secondly, just in terms of the COVID-19, it highlighted very much the critical need to measure particular situation of different groups in the society, as the degree and the way they affect are different. I'm not just talking about men and women's difference, but then even within women, ethnicity, the age group, the social class, religion, and other identity. And measuring by different groups will enable us to identify which group is left behind the most and which one next and so on. So we need to understand then what has happened and why they are left behind. And then we need to come up with strategies for these groups that are left behind to improve the situation. So we do really see, I think COVID highlighted the need to do this separately. My final point is that mainstreaming gender equality and integrating gender responsive lens requires not just a whole of government approach, which is much necessary, but a whole of society approach. So not just the government, but all stakeholders must work together. Otherwise, we can't advance. We really then need to raise awareness and understanding and then move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've run out of time, and I take the blame for not being a very great moderator. But I think the discussions have been very rich, both by the speakers as well as on the chat by the participants. So I'd really like to thank all the panelists and the participants for making this such a great learning space for everybody. Thank you so much. And this is a small world. We'll keep bumping into each other and continue to hope to grow and keep working on gender equality and gender equity on the various intersections of development. Thank you all. And now it's back to Ritu.
Thank you, Dr. Janvi. On behalf of APIA and Evaluation Community of India, I extend a hearty vote of thanks to the chair and the panelists. You spent hours preparing and for this session, and we appreciate it so much. And you stimulated a lot of conversation in the chat. So extremely thankful to you and to the participants for co-creating knowledge. I also thank my teammates at APIA and ECOI for the technical support. So enjoy the conference and let's keep learning together.